Todd McGowan, Ryan Engley, thanks for accepting my invitation to be on my podcast today.
Stephen, thanks for having us.
I've really been looking forward to this, and for listeners who are kind of tuning in, and I'm sure you'll mention it yourself in a minute. Todd and Ryan are co-hosts. Is that what's fair to say? Co-hosts of Why Theory podcasts, which I do listen to, and anyone listening, please, I recommend it, highly recommend it to you to listen to. And so today I mentioned Why Theories because I will refer to it in my questions, right? But the first question I like to ask all my guests is, for those who are tuning in, don't know you, about your background, I always ask my guests to kind of just briefly introduce themselves, tell listeners a little bit about yourself, maybe where you work, and so on and so forth. So I might, if it's okay with you, start with you, Todd, and then we'll go to Ryan.
Sure. So I teach at the University of Vermont. I'm basically a film professor, but I'm also, as the title of our podcast says, I'm also a theory professor. So I teach a lot of Hegel, psychoanalysis, German idealism, existentialism, and my books are on all of that and politics. I think, what is the most recent one? A book called Pure Excess is a book on capitalism. I guess I wrote the Cambridge Introduction to Jacques Lacan too, so that just came out. So yeah, so I wrote a book on Hegel. So that's basically it.
Yeah, I heard that podcast. I think it was an introductory text. You were talking about how painful that was for you to write that.
It was very painful, yeah, because for a couple reasons. So one reason is that my good friend Mari Rudy asked me to co-write it with her, and then she died before she wrote any of her part. And I had already written my half, and so I thought about just scrapping it. But then the editor talked me into finishing her part, and so that was painful in that way. But also, I don't know. I didn't really want to be thought of as the person who was writing an introduction to Lacan. So I guess that just is the nature of the beast now. Now a lot of people ask me about that. So it's okay, I guess. But yeah, so that's why it was. And it was painful because I knew this would happen. It was a very polemical introduction. And so I got a lot of pushback not from beginners reading it, but from Lacan experts reading it who thought I've managed to muck up the proceedings. So so it just wasn't the greatest experience, but I survived. So
I'll come back to that. You got a bit of heat. Okay. I'll come back to that. But Ryan.
Yeah. So I'm Ryan Engley. I am recently promoted, so I'm associate professor at Pomona College in Claremont, California, which is in Los Angeles County. For anyone who doesn't know where any of that is, which is fine if anyone doesn't know where any of that is. I didn't know where Pomona College was until the job was posted, so that's my failings. I'm a media studies professor, and I teach film and television. Mostly, I was mentioning to you before the podcast started that I also have interest in radio and a little bit teaching about popular music as well, which I'm kind of going to incorporate into a class into the spring semester. And I have, I'm at the final stages of, so we just got copy edits on my first book, Seriality, Media, and the Psychic Form of Everyday Life, is coming out in August of this year. And there's a lot of stages to writing a book. Todd makes it look easy, and people need to know that it's incredibly hard to write a book, and he does it all the time. So I don't think he gets enough credit for that. But so we're at the end stages of that for me, for my one book, which as I say will be out in August. I think August 6th. It's from Bloomsbury, and is available for pre-order now. And we do Y Theory, which we've been doing for 7 or 8 years.
8 years, I think.
8 years. Every 2 weeks for 8 years. That doesn't matter. The amount of stuff that we have recorded and like it doesn't matter what was going on in our lives. We've gotten together to just do a recording. It would shock people. So yeah, so we've been doing that thing for 2 presidential terms, and for more. I imagine.
Yeah, well, that's a double celebration for you this year, for sure. Like,
That's right.
The promotion, the book, and I don't know how you guys do it. You just, like with the podcast, like I know I just did season 1 last year for the first time, and I know that was a lot of hard work, and you guys really, kind of stay committed to the project.
Yeah, if I could take this
Sure.
to the start, the thing that so it's both a lot. It's a lot of this is, I don't know, shop talking that might not be interesting to everybody, but like we prep for every episode like we're prepping for grad seminar classes, and the thing is we try to talk about stuff for that we write about and think about and teach about. So on the one hand, we have however many hours it is that we're prepping that week, but also since it's part of our research and our teaching, it's like part of hundreds of hours. And then what we try to do, I think the hardest work is when we're recording, which is we're trying to make this stuff that is often it's arcane, it's difficult, it's not very user friendly. A lot of the stuff that we try to talk about, we try to make it accessible for people who may be coming to it for the first time. And so we've for the 8 years tried to do this double thing where we've tried to make it so if you haven't read any of this or watched any of films that we talk about a lot of popular films, but some are not so popular or not so recent. It's you feel like you can have like a step into that world despite not having any prior familiarity. And if you are very familiar, we like to try to give you something to think about that maybe you hadn't thought about before, or at least in a different way. And that's that's what we, a long time ago, we decided that's what we were going to do. We don't talk about it before every episode, but that's just what we do. That's the thing.
Excellent. Well, that's a nice segue into my first question, because my first question actually connects with, the Why Theory project, right? So my question really I want to start off with and kick us off with is, you've been talking about Lacanian psychoanalysis and continental philosophy, which I'm very interested in myself. And you've been bringing it to, or if you like, kind of applying it to popular culture, well over 200 episodes now. So what makes you believe, concepts like the object petit r, the real, the Hegelian dialectics could illuminate everything from Christmas films to television episodes? So it's like, I'm amazed you can do it, but you do it. But what makes you think that these concepts are applicable in such a way?
Well, I think we're both convinced, and this is a point that Hegel was really probably one of the forerunners of thinking, is that he finds his ideas out in the world and in what people have already done and thought. And so we both believe that we're not imposing something on a film or a television show or anything, but that we're actually finding the way in which the show develops the concept or ideas itself, right? So that's really important to, I think, both of us, that we're against this idea of, okay, you have the theory on the one hand, then you apply it. I think if we ever hear the word applied, even if we're talking about applying lotion to our skin, it makes us a little bit antsy, because we think, no, it's not applied.
Because it sounds to lambs, right, Todd?
Right. Right. So, but it places the lotion in the basket, right?
Yeah. Or it gets the hose again.
Right. But I think that that's really important. So that it's not that we think, we can find a way to make these ideas, I don't know, easier to understand through films and television or whatever, but instead that they're actually manifested there. And so if for instance, if Hegel's dialectic isn't manifested in Silence of the Lambs, then it's probably wrong, right? Like, it's just wrong. It has to be evident. I mean, Silence of the Lambs is actually a perfect example, because the very end of the film has this incredible dialectical reversal where you find yourself, and this is again a great Hegelian moment, where you find yourself identified with a serial killer who's about to eat someone, and you're like, go ahead, yeah, I really want you to eat him. So it's an amazing moment. I think it's one of the great moments in the history of cinema. I've talked about it hundreds of times, I think. But yeah, so I think that's it. That it's not imposition, but a discovery of the thing that's imminent to the.
I like your answer because it's very European / continental. You are right to say, like, the whole notion of application to continental philosophy and a European, kind of thinker would be, what are you talking about? This is, how can you apply a philosophy, and I agree with what you're saying. But I do think it's a unique approach, but I think it's an approach that works very well. I mean, I find it very fascinating how you do it, and I find it infinitely, kind of thought-provoking. Sorry, Ryan, you look like you were going to say something before.
Oh, well, yeah, no, just you're kind of getting into it a little bit, but as Todd said, like, for us, the every piece of culture is itself a theoretical object. So the idea is to, I think that Nietzsche has a nice critique of many different philosophers, if I'm remembering properly, that, like, basically they hide the thing that they want to find and then act like really surprised when they find it. And that's a critique. Derrida levied that critique at Psychoanalysis, which is that it has a language and an approach and ideas, and then in his criticism of Lacan specifically, in one particular text where he's talking about the Proline letter and what Lacan gets wrong about that, that it's just we just act like surprised, like, oh my God, look, here's the unconscious. And like, so Todd and I tried really hard to not put something, to not say that there's something in a text that there's no warrant for. And that's like, that requires, I think, like, you have to understand both the object and the theory, and make it, and this is, I think, really important, make it so that one is not subordinate to the other. This happens like a lot. There's a lot of really good writing that explains a lot of very complicated theory that subordinates art objects of all different kinds to the theory itself. And we try to extract where in the art object it's like exceeding someone like Hegel or someone like Lacan. Like I have this essay on bottle episodes of television, and I don't know how people read it, if they think that I'm like being glib or funny when I say this, but like I really think Hegel needs bottle episodes more than bottle episodes need Hegel to talk about. Like it's this popular aesthetic form of started in American television that makes the constraint and contradiction of Hegel's dialectic manifest in a half hour, usually of television, and like that's amazing. And I would like to think he could appreciate something like that. But those episodes are like, people like them whether they've read Hegel or not. But they nonetheless are like they're emblematic and evoking and underlining these ideas that in a way that, since they already make sense to an audience in more received in traditional ways, just like as like a sitcom or whatever, I think makes it easier to move to the theoretical, to extract this structure there that is there roiling beneath what is most immediately enjoyable about the thing itself. So that's what we try to do. And whenever we talk about objects of popular culture, is not like, bringing high theory to low culture, but just showing how in this thing that is common and for everybody, that like there's actually something complex and theoretical about it, like right from the off, like right from the second that you turn on the television.
Now, I have got a follow-up question to that, which relates to theory. And I've been in higher ed. You guys have been in higher ed for a while now. But why do you think theory, and of all places where you think theory would be done very well, you think it would be in higher ed? But my experiences is the actual contrary to that. Why do you think people are fearful of theory in general, and why is it so poorly, just for a better word, engaged with? because I have this ongoing debate with my father about, about rationality. He always makes a joke with me, go, "Oh, look, you think where rational decision making would take place, you think it would be in a university, but no, past history says that it's the one place where it's actually absent." And I have this ongoing, kind of debate and joke with my father about it. And by extension, that includes theory, engaging with theory. Like, do you kind of get what I mean by that kind of question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I think it's more true, I think, than when I say I was in graduate school in the early 1990s. And it was less true then. And I think it was less true in the 80s too, because there was this wave of interest in theory. But now it's for sure true. And I think it's almost the case, I think it's maybe totally the case that online in certain arenas, there's more interest in theory and in the general population who's paying attention to that than there is in academia. Although it's surprising the number of academics that listen to our show, actually, which is funny.
Probably because there's an absence of it in higher ed.
I think that's right. I don't think it's anything about like us or the quality of the show, but I think it's that there's just not there's a lacuna there that our show speaks to, and I think I think there's a couple reasons for that. So our friend Anna Kornblue wrote a book called Immediacy, and I think that. And it's a critique of the way we live in a culture of immediacy. And I think that's so theory is, of course, about mediation and about how you can't just take things for what they immediately are. And so I think the resistance to theory is in part about this immediacy. And there's a whole phenomenon of surface reading and like not trying to like against interpretation. And so I think all of that stuff is part of this anti-theory movement. And then I think that there's a whole suspicion of the university as such. And so one of the ways the university tries to protect itself, I think, is to turn away from theory because it's inherently political and disruptive. And so I think all those things are factors. I don't know. I mean, but I've noticed since I was in graduate school, a kind of slow turn away. And it's, so I have master's students and undergrads, and they take classes with me and Mike. We have a very theoretical department, and they want to go on to a PhD program. And I say, okay, here's a list of the 9 possible programs you can go to in the entire country. The rest are just going to be hostile to what you want to do, unless you want me to kind of ghost direct your dissertation, which I've done a couple of times, but. So I think that's just a kind of index of the extent to which there's a hostility to theory. Like in zero film programs in the US can you go and say, I want to work on, say, psychoanalysis and cinema, which you'd think is the most obvious kind of connection in the world because they're invented in the same year and cinema's like a dream. It's so obvious, but there's no place you could go to do that. So that seems like just a sign of the times. So I think you're exactly right about the dearth of interest in theory in the academy.
Yeah. Before I go to you, Ryan, I was just going to say that, by extension, not only is it anti-theory, but also, dare I say it, anti-intellectual as well. Like, not only do the managers who use the playbook, managerialism, 101 playbook, but they now banned the public lectures and banned public, kind of debates because it's just too controversial and they can't manage it. And so it actually really concerns me. Like like you'd never believe. And it just reinforces exactly what you said there, Todd, before about, they can't control it. So it's just too risky. And it oh my God, it really, I find it very upsetting, but I appreciate what you're saying there, too, because you have some years behind you. I don't mean that disrespectful.
Right. No, I know. I'm ancient. So but for sure. I think that's right.
Yeah.
We have friends who teach in at universities in Florida, and theory, like this maybe, I don't know if listeners will think this is crazy, but like theory is banned. Like you can't, like, you can't teach it, and that sounds like what are you talking about? Well, how could you legislate something like that? It's like you can't do film theory, for example. You can do film studies, you can do film history, you can't do film theory. Like theory, like this, it's like the speculative jump to move to say something might be misogynist or something might be racist or something there might be a systemic inequality of something that in the state of Florida, like you can't do that at the higher levels. And if you try, you really have to smuggle it in to do it. And so like that's in the last like 4 years. I mean, like, so when I got to grad school and, Todd and I met because I was a grad student at University of Vermont in 2012, like theory wasn't in a like I would say this online and with stuff like this, like for theory, far better than when I started graduate school. But as far as like government censorship, far worse. So that's kind of interesting. I do think that how we got here is kind of interesting and requires a bit of a speculative leap. So one thing that I would tell you is that part of the preference, I think, at the university for not theory, for something else, again, for things, at least in the humanities, that you would call studies or history, something like that, is that theory requires at least minimal speculative leap. And Todd was right to say, like, there was this movement starting in the late 90s and it's still kind of happening in the work of some like pretty big academics in America, like Rita Felsky, of moving away from having a suspicion of the hermeneutics of suspicion. So like we're moving away from the idea that there is a depth to the text at all. I think Todd and I would say we're like opposed to like a depth model, certainly a depth model of psychoanalysis, but we would prefer to say that, and this is what I was saying about television earlier, is that the depth is on the surface. These aren't opposition terms, but so there's been this move to surface reading, distant reading, and this idea that we shouldn't put pressure on students or pressure ourselves to dig deep, do a deep dive on in a text because it might not be appropriate, but you can dig deeper more into yourself and more how it makes you feel and what you want. And I'm not trying to pour cold water on that or whatever. It's not my approach, but you can kind of see like what happens is it's pushed more toward a realm where someone can't say it's wrong because it's all very personal, which leads to things like autofiction getting into theory, which Todd referenced Anna Kornbluh's book, something that she dislikes very much. I happen to think there's an inflection point in 1996 where two things happen. One thing happened. Well, Bill Clinton's reelected, I think, and then embraces the entire Republican revolution. So I would say three things. So that's what's one thing politically. The other, in academia, two things happen. One, Alan Sokol publishes a hoax article I don't even remember the title of because it's a joke, but it was published in a Duke journal. Am I right about that, Todd?
Is that part of the Grievance Studies affair?
Yes. Yeah, social text. So that's not. Text. Yep. So there's that. Then Noel Carroll and David Bordwell published a book called Post Theory, and like it's not that these two things like we walk on the street here and talk to 100 different Americans. I drive across this country a lot. I could ask everyone at every gas station, and I would imagine every single person has never heard of either of these things. So it's not important in that way. It's not like, a chart topping single, but like these two things coming out in the same year, I think was like a pretty big deal, which was this real push away from the kind of speculative and continental thinking that is at the bottom of everything that Todd and I talk about on the podcast and everything we write about and everything we research about. And it was this move toward more things that are objectively identifiable or quantifiable in some way. Like, can we quantify something cognitively? If we can't, it doesn't exist. We now know neurosurgeons, neuroscience is such a point. We've dissected the brain a billion ways. There's no such place as the unconscious. Freud is wrong. And it's like, that's not what his point is. The unconscious is this like layer of between you interacting with the social and the social interacting with you and you interacting with yourself, and you just learn all these things about how to get along in the world, but that causes friction with what you want, but also with what other people want, and the whole thing is just so much, so you just can't think about it consciously all the time. It can't be on the tip of your mind, and it's all got to go somewhere, and we just get leaden down by all of that, and it comes out in the weirdest ways, and that is something that's worth analyzing. And again, but if you're doing these other kind of more quantifiable ways of looking at these things, it's nothing. And I just think it's very dangerous. And I think it goes hand in hand. It doesn't surprise me that intellectually we have this movement toward surface reading, and then you have fascism rising, and all they want you to do is to pay attention to an aestheticized surface and not ask questions. And I don't think that any of the people who avow surface reading, when they come upon like alt-right conservative crime statistics that blame black people for every crime that they've ever committed, like there's no such thing as a systemic inequality, I think that they know that there's something else going on there. That to me, if you can look at crime statistics or things like this, and there's something else going on, that is a gesture of theory. And if what we're trying to do is to take that kernel and to make a whole big fucking bucket of popcorn about it.
No, this is great. I'm loving this. Great responses, and I like your response, Ryan, with a bit of a historical kind of background. I've got a follow-up question to that. In what way do you think Continental is responsible for some of this thinking? I'm thinking Derrida around, that there are, So I had this ongoing conversation with a colleague of mine. We're writing a book on subjectivity, and part of that book, we've actually been doing a fair bit of reading of Derrida. And I'm not a huge fan, but I understand what he's doing. He has some very, very, very important contributions to make. But I can't help but feel that Continental philosophy, and I automatically think of Derrida, is contributed to this in some way, around... There is, when it comes to just think of just interpretation, let's just start there. There is no, or reading in general, like Ryan, you mentioned reading before. Think of Derrida, there are, so do you know what I mean by that question?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really good point, Stephen. I think that there is a way in which continental philosophy kind of undermines itself. And that's one of the reasons why we were drawn to Lacan, especially. I think that Lacan, one of the things he does, and you mentioned writing a book on subjectivity. I mean, this is one of the things that Lacan really retains is subjectivity, contra the other major thinkers of France around his time, like Deleuze, Foucault, Derrida, even though they have a lot of differences between them. But one of the things that they share is this suspicion of subjectivity. And I think once you have that suspicion of subjectivity, then you kind of lose a lot of things, right? Like you lose universality, which I think is really, really important for thinking theoretically. You lose dialectics, which I think is really important for thinking theoretically. So I think that there's this abandonment of the philosophical tradition of mainly of German idealism by Derrida, but also by Foucault and by Deleuze. And that, I think that's one of the things that we've done episodes on Deleuze, my very controversial ones, because they were a little critical. So far, we haven't had the courage to do our little Foucault episodes, but I think that you're exactly right, that there's this almost self-destruction of continental philosophy that we are trying. One of the things that we're trying to do is push against that and say, no, there's this other, that no, Kant and Hegel aren't dead. They're actually more alive than, say, Derrida and Foucault. So yeah, that's a real concern of ours, I think.
Mm.
I think sometimes we have I mean, Todd, when I say, I'm going to say we, and I really mean both of us. I'm not saying we because I really mean you, but Freud, what he says about negation means you should probably think that I really mean you, but I don't. I really mean both of us. I think sometimes when we talk about, I think this happened with the Deleuze episodes is that like people were reacting to a tonality, but like that we have a tonality problem talking about certain other people. But really, what it is that like, look, I've read Deleuze a lot. Todd has also read Deleuze a lot. Derrida a lot. Whatever. Foucault. We tried to make it clear, and Todd tried to make this very clear in his answer too, that like they're not all doing the same thing. And these aren't just like people have different languages or, different vernacular for talking effectively about the same thing. Deleuze talking about subjectivation is not the same thing about Lacan talking about the subject. And to be subjectivized is not the same thing as coming into subjectivity. Those are two completely different ideas. Deleuze has a absolute suspicion of the symbolic order that Lacan finds like central to living in the social and also relating to yourself as subject. And Deleuze, like his project is to reject the symbolic order that Lacan finds. And our thing is like both of these projects are pretty well spelled out. You want to line up on one side, that is fine. We're on the side of the subject, and on the side of the subject, there's just Lacan, because for someone like Deleuze, anything that organizes and orders you, that is suspicious. And he just has an absolute problem with that. And you just can't have the two of them on that. Whereas for Lacan, anything that does like yes, desire is the desire of the other. There is this like ordering function that happens out in the social, but there's gaps. It doesn't know. No one knows. No one fully knows what they're doing. And if no one fully knows what they're doing, and everyone is out in the world doing things, it means everything out in the world that's doing things doesn't fully know what it's doing. So there has to be a gap there. And it's exactly on this point that, there's a wedge between like Lacan and Deleuze. And so you said how much of this is Continental philosophy's fault? I'll throw our profession into it. I think a lot of it's our fault too, is that like we've like it is hard to get to understand like these thinkers, and there's a lot of specialized language that it requires to engage with any of them. And when people are either one of two things, they're either gatekeeping about it or saying everyone's saying the same thing. There's no real learning happening. And it's the worst when those two things come together, where someone's being a gatekeeper and sort of implying that, look, this is a buffet. French philosophy it's post-structuralism, it's postmodern. These are all these different guys serving dishes at the same restaurant. You get what you want from each one, and then you build together your personal praxis, and that's it. And you get to experience philosophy free of any kind of conflict. And the ideas are just like you take what you want, like this, like very, very blank and empty kind of cosmopolitanism, like of ideas. And I think that's a problem. It makes it seem like it's like there is no like internal or external conflict, these ideas. It's all just you're accumulating knowledge, and it only really has knowledge in like a Jeopardy game show kind of way, where you can like interest or amaze friends who may have the same interests that you do. Like, oh, you just happen to have this obsession, but it doesn't really say anything about the real world. That's just one guy's particular vernacular that you're very good at knowing. Like, that's it. And, and a lot of people do it that way. And so, we try not to, and a lot of people we know also try not to. And when you try to make this this body of work not just the possession of elite ivory tower academia, and put it into the hands of the public, you have to, unfortunately, like take sides, take ideas, like find the divisions between things in order to make a clarity. One thing, and this is just my final thing, this was very different from when I started graduate school, and I don't exactly know how this happened, but like a lot of these French thinkers have become daddy for like a lot of people. Like when I was in grad school, Lacan wasn't anyone's daddy who they would defend online against anyone, but that's a thing now. The same for Deleuze, same for, like, I don't know. It's just, it's kind of, it's funny. I mean, it's just funny. Like, so there's there's that too. So there's a kind of, there's there's become like a social media, like online and internet way of like engaging with this stuff. And it's kind of tended, I think, more toward team sports, but the reason why that's happened is because there's not a lot of like good, cost effective, means of engaging with this sort of stuff. So things end up getting reduced to more understandable. Like, my God, the memes that I've seen about Freud, I see the same thing. I see the same tweet. Do you ever think Freud's friends were just like, shut the fuck up, man? I've seen this posted. I can't even tell you how many times I've seen that posted. And all the comments are like, they're all from different people. They're all exactly the same. What do you mean he had friends? Like, that's like the top three. Like, oh, sick burn, dude. And it's anyway. So that's kind of happening too also, which I think that the reason why that is happening is just because people in our position, it's easier to get tenure if you're making your thing really inscrutable and you're coming up with terms that really nobody understands, except for, people who are at your level and are also academics. And I think that, there's been a disserving of the public on this side of things that I think is a pretty big problem.
Ryan, I think your characterization is right on the money. It's, in fact, it's full of, like, all those themes that you pointed to are some of the criticisms leveled against continental philosophy and academics in general, right? And so I think your characterization is right on the money. Not to mention that continental philosophy is, first of all, extremely difficult to kind of engage with if you don't have any background training or understanding of history. Really, I always talk about you have to understand history in order to understand continental philosophy, because it's a very European thing, right? It's all about history. You have to understand history. And then, some of the texts are really impenetrable and very difficult to engage with. Husserl, Heidegger, you could just list them off, right? And so people can spend their whole lifetime or academic career just, kind of looking at one kind of, philosophical thinker to try and maybe understand. Oh boy, we could talk about this for a while, but I'm conscious that I've got all these other questions. So sure. I'm actually going to move, if you don't mind, I'm going to move on unless you have anything you want to add to what's already been said. But I reckon we can move on if that's all right. Now, I'll go to you, Todd, first, and then you come in. But Todd, your work, I actually have been wanting to ask this question for a while, so I wanted to go to this one. So Todd, your work on enjoying what we don't have, and I just love that concept so much. It's not funny, but that challenges the therapeutic culture's obsession with happiness and satisfaction. Now, don't get me started on our obsession with happiness in Western culture. It is an obsession. So thank you for actually talking about it. Now, can you explain how psychoanalysis reframes our relationship to dissatisfaction? So that's kind of like, it's a two-parter here. And so why is the pursuit of enjoyment fundamentally different from, and perhaps maybe more honest than, the pursuit of happiness?
Right. So in 1895, Freud co-wrote with Joseph Breuer the Studies on Hysteria. And he ends that book saying the point of psychoanalysis isn't to create happiness, but to turn hysterical misery into common unhappiness, right? And so that's kind of where I got that idea, and I think I end my book Embracing Alienation with a reference to that Freud that bit that Freud says. But so I think, what is the point? So that Freud says that directly, but I think the idea is that you recognize, and I think this is really, I think it makes sort of intuitive sense, regardless of psychoanalysis, that you recognize, I think, as you go through psychoanalytic thinking, that the obstacle, things that are in your way of getting the object that you supposedly desire, that it's really the obstacle that infuses that object, with its desirability, not the object in itself. And so, that way of thinking about the obstacle seems like to me a real like that's the revolutionary take, right? Like that's the revolutionary way to change your way of thinking. And then that ties into your second question, which is, why is, how can enjoyment instead of happiness, right? Well, enjoyment for look, I mean, Freud doesn't use the term, but for Lacan and for me, and I think for Ryan, like enjoyment comes from not the getting of the object, but for the different kinds of trouble that we give ourselves in our way of in our lives, right? So there's enjoyment, say, in smoking a cigarette. Why? Because you're giving yourself trouble in the sense of you're giving yourself lung cancer, right? Like I don't smoke, but I know, that's many relatives of mine died of that form of enjoyment. So I think that's or whatever it is, right? Like Ryan and I are both sports fans, and the teams that we root for tend to lose more than they win. And so that's a form of enjoyment, right? Historically, right. That's a form of enjoyment. So it's, I mean, and it's interesting to contrast the pleasure of the win with the enjoyment of the struggle or the loss or the barrier, the obstacle. And so that to me is, if you think about how short the time is after you've gotten something that the pleasure endures compared with how long the enjoyment is of the struggle that created by the obstacle or the barrier in the way of getting that object, I think then it's kind of clear why enjoyment is superior to happiness, right? Because it has more of this struggle and trouble and I don't know about you, but I always think to myself, if I just had a little free time, I have this book on Kant, I really want to just sit down and read it. And so over this break before Christmas, I had just some free time and I sit down, I read it for like an hour, and then I said, I'll look at this German podcast, and I look around. So I end up wasting all this time. But then if I have all these obstacles, I don't have time to read the book. Then I actually read more of the book than when I just had the free time, right? So I think that's the real lesson of psychoanalysis, that it's the barrier that actually functions as a drive to do something. Whereas if you just have free access to something, it ceases to be desirable at all.
Music is the great example of that right now, right? Like there's just everything's on Apple Music or Spotify right now, and none of it is as meaningful as if you went to a record store and you saw a cover of an album that spoke to you in some way, and you're like, I've never heard of this band before, and you're just like, you know what? It's $18. I can take a chance for $18, and you go home and you play it, and you love it or whatever, and then then that spins into something else. That's I suppose someone could accuse me of some nostalgia in that, but I mean, what I'm really, and yeah, I'm sure that's there, but what I'm really talking about is that like the limitation makes it meaningful, and the plenitude. And Todd uses the great word, like the access, like just strips something of meaning. Like the American football teams that Todd and I root for are just terrible, and we don't have time to get into it because like no one cares. But the way, Todd, did you know? Actually, I'm going to tell Todd this directly. I don't know if this would mean anything to you, Stephen. This can get cut out later. Todd, do you know that the Jets threw for 720 yards in the first half of throughout the entire season? The first half, that was the least in the league. Do you know who was number 2 and what the number was?
No.
It was the Raiders, and it was 1,200. So that's the second most inept team, and they're almost twice as good anyway. So whatever. So I just set that up. So Todd and I also together, we root for the Boston Celtics, and they're very historically very good. And a couple years ago, they won the NBA Finals. And it was great, but I think if you and I are both being pretty honest, we did not care.
I mean, we didn't even talk about it. We didn't have one conversation about it. We didn't even say like, true. Oh, that was fun. Yeah. So I think there's winning leaves you with nothing to talk about. I think it's really true. So that's a big thing. I think the I would just say one last thing about this song. And I think I'm dating myself really, like the radio, right? Like it used to be, you didn't have the song, you just happened to hear it on the radio. I have this little conspiracy theory that Joni Mitchell took her music off of Spotify, not because of Joe Rogan or anything, but just because she wanted to make her music desirable again for people because they couldn't just listen to it on Spotify. So I think that, although she's now put it back, so that's lost. But yeah, I think that the radio, like when you could just hear on the radio and you had to listen, hoping the song that you liked came on, I think that's just a vastly different world. And then I think what you're enjoying is that you actually enjoy, this is why that title, I'm sad that I wasted that title on a book that's kind of mediocre, because I love that title and I wish I could use it again. If I was Alfred Hitchcock, I would just name a future. I would just do it again and say, oh, this one's just better. That's what he did with the film called The Man Who Knew Too Much. He didn't like although the first version is better, he was wrong. And he just renamed it named the second film.
You could do Enjoying What We Don't Have Too. This time it's personal. Like, that's, I don't know. I think that's a good title.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Anyway, yeah. So, but I think that idea of enjoying what we don't have, like when you're listening to the radio, you're enjoying the song all the times it doesn't come on, right? Like that, I think is the real key idea. And that's the shift that we're often talking about on the podcast, like that way of trying to see how what you're enjoying is actually what's not there rather than what is there.
Yeah. I like, this is why I like the concept so much, because I also think it includes, and it's inclusive of suffering too. Like I know it culturally, that's a taboo type of topic, right? To suffer. But there's an enjoyment level in suffering, right? So, because when I hear you talk, I automatically think, oh, hang on, that's just a form of suffering, like
right, absolutely. No, Stephen, it's absolutely true. And our friend Alenka Zupancic says the definition of enjoyment is pleasure to the point, suffering one's pleasure, right? So I think I think that's exactly right. Like that, there has to be, and I think to me, like the one thing that I think you're right about this cultural taboo on suffering is just bad. And I think that's lamentable. But I also think that you have to, if you don't see the connection between suffering and enjoyment, then you're going to miss out on the possibilities for enjoyment. Like that's just, there's no kind of enjoyment you have that you don't suffer. Like not every enjoyment is like heroin use where you really suffer it, but I think it's a kind of good model. And I mean, not a good model in the sense that people should do it, but in the sense that the suffering of it is very evident. And but it's true for everything, right? Like I enjoy writing books, but they're also incredible. They're painful to do. And, and even reading Hegel, it's a painful process, but it's also the most enjoyable process in my life, I think. So that I think that's really such a crucial idea. And I think I wonder if this taboo on theorizing is linked to what you just mentioned, this taboo on suffering and so we have to find
without a doubt. I mean, I always think of the myth of Sisyphus, right? And everyone just despairs, the whole concept, of the rock going up the mountain. But then people think, again, hang on, think about what happens when he gets to the top of the hill and the rock is going down. There's a moment of relief and enjoyment, So Camus has some very interesting things to say about this, of course. In the myth of Sisyphus here, and I think Albert Camus has some very interesting things to say about this very topic. But I can't help but feel that's what you're talking about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I was just watching to catch up because the new season starts tomorrow. I think this show called The Pit, which is about a emergency room one day, and one of the nurses complained. She says to the head of the ER, she said, "You've given me a Sisyphusian task," and he goes, "Well, but it's an honor to get that. And she goes, Sisyphus was punished by the gods. And then the head of the ER, he quotes the very last line of Camus. He goes, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. And she just has no idea what to say. And I thought that's pretty great that was in a popular show, like that was clearly most people probably didn't know that was a Albert Camus quote, but nonetheless, it was in there. So I think I think that idea is exactly right. That the struggle of going up is Camus even
that's the enjoyment. That's the enjoyment.
Right, exactly. That's the enjoyment. And Camus even says the boulder is his thing, right? Like I don't think it's a reference to Lacan and the notion of das Ding, but it's kind of that idea that there's a sublimity to the boulder that and precisely as a barrier, as an obstacle.
There's a video game came out a few years ago called Hades, where it's very the tone is very glib and anyway, you're fighting through the underworld because your father is Hades, and you're trying to find your mother. He's hidden anyway. It's this whole thing. But one of the people you meet, one of the characters you meet throughout is Sisyphus, and he's just kind of like really jocular about the rock, which he just calls Boldy. Me and Boldy were just anyway. So he gives you like items or whatever. And there was this conversation I remember that was kind of happening online where people were sad for it. It seemed very clear to me that it was younger people who weren't familiar with the myth were coming to what's going on with Sisyphus for the first time, and they just. I remember my friend was sent me the screenshot of some people earnestly saying it's a shame he can't decorate his rock, and I thought that is the most symptomatic thing that I can imagine for like the 21st century is that rather than engaging with contradiction or even the like enjoyment from suffering, what the prescription is that like you should be able to decorate your burdens and then it won't be so bad. And that's it. Like, what if your burdens what if it was a subscription service and you just paid for it a little bit, like per month, and so then you didn't have to think about it as a burden? What if it was broken up like that? And I kind of think that's where we're at. Is that like I don't know, if we're pushing the rock that we don't know, and then if you are someone who acknowledges the rock, that's a problem. You're not really happy. You should try to be happy. Try, like just do more self-care. Sisyphus really just should have done some self-care. and that would have helped. That would have sorted him right out.
I mean, it's spawned a whole industry, this whole kind of obsession with happiness, this whole self-help movement. It's just big money. But just on a side, I can't help but think of as someone who's really into Nietzsche. I mean, of course, there's the doctrine of the eternal return, right? So it's the same kind of concept, this cyclical, kind of, suffering and enjoyment. And, like as someone who's really into Nietzsche, I'm not sure if you're familiar with doctrine of the eternal return, but I just can't help think of it's the same type of concept, but approached from a different, kind of perspective or point of view. And anyway, I want to move on. But earlier you mentioned film as public dreaming, and I want to return to that because I actually like that a lot because I was just happened to be watching Train Dreams, which feels like a dream. I'm actually watching it, and I'm like going, hang on, this just feels like a dream. It's like how they kind of capture the images and the cinematography. It just feels like a dream. It's a great film. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but I guess my question goes to I mean, how does cinema bypass bypass our conscious defenses and then expose deeper truths and desire and fantasy? Because you've talked a lot about desire and fantasy, but let's go to really important questions here around desire and fantasy. What's going on here?
Yeah. So I think that if you find a film, to me, a film is a public depiction of a fantasy, right? And so if you find it engaging, then it's in some way And you might not even know why, because it might be engaged. It's unconsciously engaging your own fantasy life, right? In some way. And if you don't find it engaging at all, it's probably not doing that. So I think that to me often accounts for differences in taste across different films, right? As to the question of how it can do it, I think that it's part of it is, and this is why I think it's very sad, the death of the theater, because I think one of the key things about the large screen is that you can't pay attention to anything else this is why, people try to react against this by looking at their phone and texting during the cinema or doing whatever they do, right? But theoretically, you can't look at anything else. There's no other lights. It's just the screen occupies your whole attention. Whereas if you watch at home, there's other things going on. You got other things in the room. You can pay attention to those. And it's a way of not totally subsuming you within the film. And I think, and that total subsumption is, I think, that gives the film the dreamlike quality that it has. And I think the contrast is really interesting between cinema and theater, because theater doesn't absorb you like that at all, right? Like theater, when you go to the theater, you're very much part of a public watching the play, right? Like you're all together, you can see everybody, you look around. But when you're to watch a film is to be totally ensconced in your private world, which is why any kind of disturbance around you is so upsetting, like somebody talking, anything like that. It's really upsetting because it disturbs your phantasmatic investment in the film, I think. So that's what I think that's the key thing, is that it's totally consuming. And I think that's also why you can, this is not my idea, it's an idea from Christian Metz, that's why you can doze off, because you're so invested in this public fantasy that you can you kind of lose even conscious, you lose consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's to me, that's the real dimension. And I think it happens less, the smaller the screen, the less it happens, just because the distractions, I think, get in the way of investing in the fantasy. And I think that's why I kind of feel like that's why people are wary of going to the cinema, because of the power that it has over us. Mm. And I think that's why I like it.
Mm. Mm. Yeah. I don't know if, Todd, have you ever taught or read James Monaco's, or Stephen, if you, James Monaco's How to Read a Film? You know this?
No.
Like no. So I often taught in, this is there's another thing. There's a lot of, he's not exactly anti-theory, but he's not very much into theory, but there's a lot of like intro to film books that are less than enamored with theory. And I think that's David Wardwell and Kristen Thompson's being probably the standard bearer for that. So right. that has also helped to mitigate theory in our part of the humanities. But anyway, James Monaco makes this point, as I remember, in How to Read a Film, that there were two initial ideas for film, and it was the Lumiere brothers in France, and it was Thomas Edison in America. And Edison's idea was for a single person to watch a single thing in a dark room. And the thing that won out was Lumiere brothers as the public spectacle. So what you had an idea in America of the privacy of the film, or this idea coming from Europe of like as a public spectacle. And that's what won out. But over time, it kind of feels like Edison's winning out. And it's interesting that we had these two different ideas at what could have been, or, the birth of cinema, but it went in the direction of the cinema of attractions. And now we're on this path for it to be like more private and smaller. And I think that the right thing won. Just because the private thing is winning now doesn't mean it's the right thing. I think the right thing won in the beginning, and it's exactly what Todd said, is that when you are with other people, like you suddenly, if you're enjoying just imagine the scenario where you're with a bunch of people and you're all like It just, you can feel it in the theater. Everyone's really enjoying this film. That is like, you're both a part of something. There's also a little bit of like, oh, I guess I'm really not that unique. But then it's also like, well, it doesn't really matter. Like, you know, I'm engaging in this thing with everybody else. There's something kind of really beautiful about it. It also works the other way. I've been in theaters before where everyone hates the movie. That rocks too. Like that's amazing. There's something really great. There's something really great about that too. There's something you can come together that way. And I just think that there's just no way to replace or to replicate that when the screen gets smaller and the viewing becomes more private. But what it does, it is less traumatic. I will certainly say that. The cinema is a confrontation, and even if it's the best film, it's the best cinema, you have to confront other people's idiosyncrasies and like, again, being loud or being like in any number of different ways, or they're eating something or their phone goes off. There's all these different things. Like you are subject to the public. We are all subject to the public when we're a part of it. And there are so many ways now to like opt out of it, like with the AirPods in the head, and then you go to the self checkout. Like you can opt out of being in the public all the time while you're being in the public, and it's like being a rich person while being a poor person, and I just think it's a huge problem because what the rich get to do is they get to avoid the public, and they get to avoid all of us, and they get their food delivered from them like DoorDash or Uber Eats. They like other people make it. There are all these things, so we have all these things that are available to us that simulate the life of the rich, but we can't afford it. And it makes us unhappy when we try to get it anyway, because we really should be engaging with is the confrontation of the public. And if we're not doing it at something that is as easy to engage with the confrontation of the public at a theater, at a film theater, at a cinema, then we certainly can't do it at the polls. Like we can't do it like politically. I just think that those things are tied. That like the less that there is a public watching films or engaging in spectacle like that, the less that we can find ourselves a public politically speaking, and I think that helps to underwrite a lot of ideologically the problems that are happening right now.
Yeah. The logical follow-up question I have to that is film a form of design fantasy? What does that say about the filmmaker, the people who watch the films? What does that say about society in general?
Yeah, I don't think it's a really interesting question, Stephen, because I think that the filmmaker is in a certain way a servant to the desire of the spectator, right? Because they're trying to make a film so Freud's theory was the opposite. Freud thought that artists have their own fantasies and then they're lucky enough that other people will find their fantasies enjoyable, right? But I don't think that's right. Like, I think actually the artist or the filmmaker especially, like they're trying to, they have their own idea, of course, but I think they're trying to find a way to make it publicly acceptable or publicly enjoyable, right? And so I think that's a very hard process, and you really have to subsume yourself into what you imagine. And this is an idea from Jacques Lacan, what you imagine the desire of the other is, right? Like that's what you do when you make a film. And I think the test screening is kind of, oh, did I hit the desire of the other or did I not? Right. Like I was once at a test screening for the movie Deep Impact, and people kept, it's not a good movie. And it was even worse in the test screening. They did fix it a little bit. But people kept laughing at things that weren't supposed to be funny.
Laughing at the wrong time.
And we were on the Paramount lot, and they had these little PAs that came running up with a clipboard if they heard you laughing, and they're like, okay, exactly what were you laughing at? Wow. And then they were going to change that. So what they were doing was, and some of it did get changed. What they were doing was, how is this film not speaking to the desire of the other? So I think as a filmmaker, that's what you try to do. You try to speak to the desire of the other, and it's not that you try to just, I think you can't, there's not a formula for it, right? I think that's what's so interesting. I think Hollywood studio moguls want there to be, to the extent that they exist, they want there to be a formula like sequel, make this just like the other thing, etc. But I think because the desire never is for the exact same thing, it's for something that seems different that is the same, right? And so that's, and I think that great filmmaker is able to do that. But I don't think it's necessarily their desire. I think it's they're trying to in some way understand the desire of the spectator, which I think is incredibly hard.
Yeah, I mean, I just, when I think of, the gratuitous violence and how some people just get off on that, I can't help but think of, like kind of Freud, Death Drive, people, kind of take great enjoyment out of others' suffering. There are so many themes here. It's not funny. And I always say, look, what does that say about the person, who is getting off on these films? You know what I mean? I particularly, I think of like war movies. Oh my God, there is a lot of, as a genre, holy moly, there is a lot of war films.
Well, I think Francois Truffaut was exactly right when he said every war film is a pro-war film, right? I think to me, that's just evidently true, right? And I think you're right. Like I feel the same way about the gangster film. We were kind of going through every genre on Y Theory, and I think the gangster film is the only classical genre. Am I right that we haven't?
And it's because we're just on opposite sides of it. I happen to like it, and Todd happens to find it. If you tell me if this goes too far, he happens to find it valueless. So
I think that's fair? True. Like it's fair. Yeah. It's a fair. So when I have inevitably male students come in and go, man, The Godfather, it's so I just want to reach, I want to reach for my gun. So which would be a gangster thing to do, of course.
That would be a very gangster thing to do, as I'm always telling you. Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, the Truffaut line is a good one. And I can only think of, there are the war films that we don't, this I might add is just a little bit of a rider, is that I think, so there's a film that is quite good that we don't talk about anymore. It's called The Best Years of Our Lives, and it's that's a William Wyler film. It's long, but it's kind of it's tough at points, and it's not. I think that's about as close to like one that like a film that was made prior to him saying that I would have wished that somebody could have asked him a follow-up question. What do you think about The Best Year? Because I'm sure he saw it. He probably
I'm sure
did.
He saw it. Yeah.
I'm sure he saw it. And it's you have three vets coming home.
See, he'd say it wasn't a war film because it's not depicting actual war.
So there, okay, yeah. Fair. That's fair enough. I think there's one who's traumatized from it. There's one who lost he had to have a limb amputated, and there's a real life guy whose name I'm forgetting, who was the subject of I think it was like a Navy video, like showing how the Navy was helping people like put their lives back together after if they had they like had to have they now have a limb difference, right? So he was the subject of it. And Wyler saw this film that the Navy put out, and he went to this guy to have cast him in the movie. So he was a non-actor who was disabled because of the war. And then there's another guy who became an alcoholic they just come back to like the world being like completely changed and confronting with like, what it is that they did. And anyway, it has, because I know you haven't seen it, Todd, it has maybe this is my one bit to entice you. It has the best 180-degree rule violation I've ever seen. Yeah. So it's so subtle. You don't even think he's done that. It's really great. So anyway, so to your question though is about like what is what's popular and what is it that gets repeated that tells us about a spectator or spectatorship or in general like the social
or even their desires and fantasies. So that's the interesting part of that. My follow-up question is that what does it say about our desires and fantasies, really?
I think so. I think so. I want to come at this two ways. One is I think that Hollywood, Todd was kind of getting at this. Hollywood would love to believe that they could know what they are, what our desires and fantasies are, because they like they can't will something to be a hit. Like it can't be done. Even in this era, like if people aren't vibing with something or cathecting with it, to use a Freudian terminology, you can't force it. And then it's frustrating. It's like, well, wait a minute, you liked this thing 3 years ago. Why don't you like it now? And I think the best answer that you can get from people, if you're doing like audience commentary, is they go like, I don't know. I think that's the thing. Like why was it okay? So as far as like there's all kinds of explanations for why the superhero films of now aren't as good as the ones that were before Endgame. And it's like, oh, okay. So when a 30 movie story ended, and then the things after that you didn't like so much, I don't think it has anything to do with how good they were made or bad. It's that there was a 30 film story that was being told, and then it ended, and now you're not tied to any of it anymore. And there's like nothing there's nothing they could make the best superhero. They could make the best superhero film, but people aren't tied to it emotionally anymore. They can't force you to do that. And so there's a dimension where at the level of production and distribution and just like that, it can't be forced. It can be made, but not willed to be popular. So so what I'm trying to say is that I sometimes think what doesn't hit is also revelatory. And I think that's important. But like, right now we're dealing with a thing where people, like the younger generation, like our students, like they really don't like seeing any kind of explicit sex in the movies, which is really interesting. So I teach a lot of like code era Hollywood films, and I just know that they like that a lot better. That there's not like they don't have to. They much prefer.
There are certainly less sex scenes in movies today. That's for sure.
Yeah, they much prefer that. Robert Mitchum and who is it in Out of the Past? It's
Jane Greer
embrace, and then the music swells and a door blows open and it's sopping wet outside.
Or a fountain,
think about the semiotics of the
fountain going up.
Right, exactly. But that's much more preferable to then like you have to watch two actors kind of fumble around under the covers a little bit, and you see someone's ass. You're not sure which one, and that's the art of that particular scene for that filmmaker. So that I think is saying something too, and I think that again, film is already this like it's this a priori confrontation, and I think what can be revelatory is what is it at a certain time that we don't want to be further confronted with in the diegesis or in montage or in close-up. And I think close-up is a thing. Like we don't have a lot of the Hollywood close-up, the close-up of the the code era of classic Hollywood. We don't really do that so much anymore. There's a lot of mid shots or just not quite as close-ups. We're certainly not Joan of Arc is not happening every month at the cinema. And I kind of think that if I was going to have a more global commentary about like this moment in contemporary cinema, is I think people are really uncomfortable being too close. That's what I would say, and I think that's maybe an issue.
Yeah, I think we could talk about this for a long time, and I'm actually conscious of the time here. Time's kind of getting away from us a little bit here, but I'm going to go with three questions. And out of those three, I have to ask you a question about Lacan. Now, sure. I have actually really enjoyed your episodes on Lacan's seminars, but you've been working through Lacan's later seminars, particularly his move away from the signifying chain toward the concept of non-relation. Now, so what's at stake here in this theoretical shift, and how does I'll start this bit again. How does understanding that there is no sexual relationship change how we think about connection, intimacy, and politics?
Yeah, so this occurs for the first time. He says there is no sexual relation at the end of seminar 16, which is in the late 1960s, right? And so and then he says the signifying chain works and it holds together like Olympic rings. And then he starts to theorize this thing called the Borromean knot, where if you pull one string, then the whole knot collapses, whereas the Olympic rings, that's not true. And so his idea is that the signifying chain is held together, or he used to think this. He's not ever clear that I used to think one thing and now I think another, but that's what's happening here. And the signifying chain holds together like Olympic rings. And so there's much more space for interpretation in the earlier Lacan. And I think once you get to this idea of the non-relation, there is no sexual relation, I think one of the things he's doing is saying, I'll finish that thought. One of the things that he's doing is saying that the interpretation doesn't work like I thought it worked before, because there's not just a signifying chain that has a certain signification, and you can make sense of it, and you can find out where it begins and where it ends, and the gap within it, etc. So he doesn't think that anymore. Instead, he thinks that there's these two forms, what he calls male and what he calls female, of two different structures, and that they have no point of connection or relation to each other. And so all that you can do is try to find your own way within that. And that's where he comes up with this idea. And his way of doing that is he invents this signifier that he calls the symptôme, which is a older version of the word symptom in French, in earlier French. And the idea is that in place of the signifying structure with the master signifier and then a whole structure following from it, you just have this individualized symptôme. And so it's it's less focused on interpretation, later version, and it's a much more individualized version, which leads, a lot of people think, well, that makes sense of our era because we live in a more psychotic kind of era. And in fact, it led Lacan's chief disciple, Jacques-Alain Miller, to invent this idea of what he called ordinary psychosis. And this has become, among practitioners especially, a very common way of diagnosing patients. And it's less popular, I think, among cultural theorists like us, but I think it does have some resonance. So that's, to me, the difference is one is more like you're kind of stuck in your own individual subjectivity, and the other one is like, oh no, you're part of a larger signifying structure. So I think that's the basic distinction. And I don't know, I find more value in the notion of the signifying chain and that idea of interpretation, and I think we're still kind of in that. I'm less convinced by this move that he makes later into the non-relation.
Okay, yeah. So this isn't the announced point of my book on seriality, but I do try to think in that book, because I wanted to, when my mom knows this is true. When I wrote my book, I wanted it to be a book my mother could read about Lacan and Hegel. And what I mean, like, my mother has an associate's degree. Like, she's not a professor. She's a smart lady. She doesn't think she's educated. But I wanted it to be a book that people could read if maybe it was their first theory book. So I was convinced at a kind of an early stage that going very, very heavy into this thread would be a kind of I don't know, no matter what there was nothing I could do to not make it a kind of a gatekeeping way of approaching my idea of seriality. But I will say this is not the announced point of the book, but what I try to do in that text, which is coming out in August, is to think of a relation of non-relation, which is at the time that Lacan articulates non-relation, he doesn't think there is a way that you can think relation alongside of it, just as what Todd said, that these are two opposed structures. There's a signifying chain, and then there's non-relation. And I think there's a thread, there's breadcrumbs in a way that we could kind of bring these two together, which doesn't mean, I want to be really clear, which doesn't mean that Lacan thought that, because he didn't. And it doesn't mean that like, the idea that it's easy, that you can just it has to be theorized through this, a concept that I'm developing as seriality sort of overrides his concerns, I guess. So I'm sure he wouldn't listen to me if he ever had to listen to me explain how these two ideas could work in concert. But for me, it's the contradiction understood as the Hegelian contradiction, this impasse that knots the thing together. I think that can work together, but it's not in Lacan. It's exactly as Todd said. Like he thinks one thing for a really long time, and he moves toward this other idea that I think gets to be almost to a point where it's like it's such a, and this is the trick with I think with theorizing a psychosis, and he was aware of this, like, as you know, in his earlier seminars as well, which is that like when you're talking about a psychotic structure, how much of it can you actually talk about? Because if what you're saying is this thing that is like it's so, like, the idea of the santome is this symptom that is so proximate, such a nerve knotting together a subject that it can't even be brought to the symbolic, then how much logically can you say about it? I know, Todd, that's kind of an issue that I think that you have with the idea, and I think it admits a structural problem. I think unless you're making the choice, I think we would say, like, if you're going to talk about Lacan of the santome, I think that's consistent. If you talk about Lacan of the symptom, I think that's also consistent, but without a way to make those two tracks work together where you're not subordinating one of those ideas to another, then those are the stakes, to answer your question. Like it's a real shift, and it's a real rift in his thinking, which is what makes it interesting. But it is like it's a gap that has to be bridged. Or you have to find yourself on one side of it.
Yeah, I can't say I'm a Lacanian expert, but since I've been listening to your episodes, I've got to re-listen to them again. But I'm going to get hold of some literature and do a bit more of a deep dive. I mean, is there anything you would recommend that I should go to as a bit of a deep dive on Lacan? I mean,
yeah, I think I did a little YouTube video about the books on Lacan that I really liked. And I mean, I think probably my favorite book on Lacan is by our friend Rick, I guess you'd find it under Richard Boothby, called Freud. It's called Freud as Philosopher. And I think it's the subtitle is something like Lacan or Metapsychology after Lacan, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's a really good one. But I think, most of Slavoy's earlier books, like Sublime Object, I think is really good. And I think Looking Awry is really good. And then Joan Kopchak's book, Read My Desire, is incredible. I think Bruce Fink, both of his introductory texts, so the Lacanian subject and a clinical introduction to Lacanian psychoanalysis, I think are both pretty good. And Calum Neal wrote a really short book. It's called Lacan: The Basics, I think, and I think it's quite good. So those. Yeah,
that's very useful. I mean, we're running out of time, and I've got two more questions. And interesting, I mentioned books. The second last question I have for Aurelia, and you can answer this however you like, is I always ask my invited guests, to mention 3 books that have influenced their thinking. You feel free to plug your work here, by the way, gentlemen. But I'll start with you, Todd, because we've been going in that order the whole interview. But 3 books. They could be yours. It could be anything. Just 3 books. And what I'll do is I'll put the details, citation details in the episode descriptor.
Yeah, my for better or worse, my own books have not influenced my thinking at all. No, I would say number one is Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Like that was just a decisive book for me. And then number two, this is not in order because I read this. I mean, this is chronological order. Number two would be Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness. So far, I've picked two 800-page, or not, but very long books. So I'll try to pick a short one for the third thing. And I think I just mentioned this, a book that was really, really influential for me when I read it when it first came out in 1994, Joan Kopchek's Read My Desire. So I think that's a really good, it's a book about Lacan, but it's also a book about this opposition between Lacan and historicism, and that when we were talking about the place of theory in the academy and its marginalization, that's really the secret theme of that book. So that I find that very helpful. So those would be the three.
Yeah, that's Todd took a couple, so I'll try to be a little bit different. But I will just say that I tried, I think it was not until like the third time that I read Phenomenology of Spirit was when it clicked for me. And the first one was wait, I'm not asking you like you would know, but would I have
you didn't read it under me? No.
No, I know that. That's why I'm not asking that. It's the Bailey, it's not Wallace who did an early
translation. Miller translation, I think, is what you probably read.
No, I know that. That was in the 70s, but the earlier American one was that William Wallace?
J.B. Bailey.
Bailey. Okay.
Wallace never translated the Phenomenology.
Okay, all right. That was my question. So, okay, so I started reading the Miller, then I read the Bailey, then I read the Miller again. Was how I did it, and more recently, I'll just be very specific. Todd and I both think the Michael Inwood translation, the recent one from Cambridge, is really spectacular. We might even in the future we did.
I think it's Oxford.
It's Oxford. Okay, right. Oh, right. Yeah, you're right. It's because Oxford and Cambridge. It's confusing. They both put out translations like almost at the exact same time.
I think 1 year apart, right? And then Notre Dame put one out another year apart. So it's like there have been a ton of recent translations. And as Ryan says, we like the Michael Inwood one best.
It's quite good. It's so good that we might do an episode. We did however many episodes we did going through phenomenology, but we might do it again for that. So I have to mention that. I certainly have to mention Joan's book because it was a huge deal for me. And getting to learn from her was also incredible. But okay, so outside of that, I'll give you three books that Todd didn't mention. One, which is Slavoj Žižek's Looking Awry, which made a lot of things click for me in a way that I didn't understand previously. And I will also mention Alenka Zipansic's The Odd One In. That was a really big book for me that on her theory of comedy. That was pretty revelatory. And then I think I'm looking over here. Todd mentioned Rick Boothby's book, which was huge, so I won't mention it again. But Molly Ann Rothenberg's book, The Excessive Subject, was really important for me as well. So I'm gonna recommend those three. Those are very just clarifying books, and I think great reads at the sentence level as well, which is not always the case in our world of creativity.
I think you've done very well. I love asking this question. So I think you've done very well to kind of answer it reasonably succinctly, I should add too, by the way. I ask academics, and so it can take them 30 minutes just to answer that one question. So I think you've done very well. All right, last question I have, and I always ask my invited guests this is, look, do you think there's anything you've missed, or do you think there's anything we've missed, or do you think there's anything you'd like to add before we finish?
I just want to say one thing that I think one of the great challenges is to think psychoanalysis. This is what we try to do on the podcast, along with German idealism. I mean, we've kind of been talking around that, but I think that connection is really important to make, and maybe the most important thing to think about in our contemporary situation. So that's what I mean, that's, if there's like a highlight of the conversation, that would be it for me.
Yeah, I'll go in the same direction, which is that like it on our show, and then in this, conversation, like there's value in trying to continue to tap what may otherwise look like a dry well. And I think that's like there's a lot of things, especially with Freud, where it's like all the things that he came up with that are brilliant because they're just parts of culture, are just parts of culture. Like, when Ted Cruz says, let's stop attacking pedophiles, everyone's like, Freudian slip. Like, he said the truth. He knows what he's saying. But it's like Freud, like, that wasn't an idea that he didn't call it that. That'd be awful. It'd be awfully very phallic to name a concept after yourself. But he called it a parapraxis. We just call it that because we don't say parapraxis. But there are all kinds of things that were Freudian slips that we don't talk about. Mishearing, misreading, miswriting, forgetting, separate from repression. A distinct concept. And I think that there's so much of what Freud and others, Hegel, Kant, I would even extend this, certainly to Foucault. My God, whenever anyone talks about power, the way they're talking about it is implicitly like Foucauldian, whether they know it or not. Like, so there are all these ideas in the philosophers that we talk about, and in the ones that we align more of our theoretical trajectory from, and some like outside of it, that are a part of the way that people talk about the world. And what's unfortunate is that, people take those things. I just think the Freudian slip is a great example. They just take it like, oh no, but that's just how the world works. The world works is that, like, oh yeah, sometimes people are trying to say one thing, but they really tell you the truth. And it's like, no, that was discovered and argued for and fought for. That's a theoretical idea. That's not just a fact of existence. People didn't think that before. I remember I was in a graduate class where a fellow student who did not like Freud and did not like psychoanalysis was trying to ask the professor, who was not exactly also Freudian either, to say, like, how did people talk about the unconscious before Freud? And I'll never forget it. She just said, no one did. No one talked about it before. She was like, no, but how would people have said? No one would have talked about it. Not in any of the way that you would want to talk about. No one talked about it. It's just, so you either work with how Freud talked about it, like find the edges if you're disagreeing with him, or you're just like, you're dispensing with the concept. There's not a before on that. And it's so many ideas that are theory are part of just lingua franca. They're just a part of being in the world. Mm-hmm. And we, through the repetition, kind of have made it as though they are natural facts and not theoretical. And then I think we do it too, where it's like, oh, well, no, the public talks about Freudian slip, so I can't talk about it either. That doesn't make it like everyone knows that idea, so I have to talk about something else. And it's like, these are the great entry points for doing deeper work, and don't imagine that well is dry. There's a lot more there. And anyway, Todd and I try to get to that.
Yeah, I think we could go for another hour or two, and I'm conscious of the time. And I want to say thanks, Todd and Ryan, for your time. I really appreciate it. I've really enjoyed it. And can I encourage anyone listening today, please make sure you check out Why Theory, which is the podcast that Todd and Ryan, kind of co-host. I enjoy it. Like I said, I've been listening to the Lacan episodes, but there are other more interesting kind of episodes as well. But thanks for your time, Todd and Ryan. But we've run out of time. But thanks for accepting my invitation.
Oh, Stephen, thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Stephen.